Greetings from Brother Stephen. I'm a disciple and witness of Jesus Christ. To all the inhabitants of the earth, I present to you as a witness the gospel of the kingdom. In this lesson today, titled The Progeny of Qayin, we're going to be going over Genesis chapter 17, Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 through 24. Like always, we're going to read first in the King James Version, Oxford edition of 1769, which is a false translation of the Bible. It is a plagiarized version of the King James Version Bible of 1611, and I'll go over this in detail in the study on the YouTube channel titled Christ's Name is Jesus, not Jesus. I'm going to do something a little different in this lesson. As I'm reading through the King James Version, the Oxford edition of 1769, I'm going to kind of be having a review at the same time at the end of certain verses. Beginning at verse 17, it says that Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he built a city and called the name of that city after the name of his son Enoch, or Enoch, or Enoch. When you go to Genesis chapter 4, verse 16, when it talks about and Qayin went out from the presence of Jehovah and lived in the land of Nod, which is Iran, modern day Iran, on the east of the Fertile Crescent. So basically what I have here is somewhere in this location is where he would have built the city in the name of Enoch. Verse 18 says, and unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mahujala. And I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher these names. These names are just not common. And Mahujala begat Methuselah, and Methuselah begat Lamech, and Lamech took unto him two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah, and Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such that dwelt in tents, and of such as have cattle. And his brother name was Jubal. He was the father of such as handled the harp and the organ. In other words, they invented instruments. They were musicians. And one of the things that I want to point out is all this stuff happens before the flood, but after the fall. Man did not start creating his own inventions until after the fall, after their mind's eye was opened up to understand scientific knowledge. When you go to Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, it says, and their mind's eye, the reason it's bold and italic is because I added it in there. And their mind's eye. And again, because that eye is referring to the imagination and the consciousness of a person. It's somehow of them both is referring to Adam and Kava. It says were open, and they understood that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and invented themselves skirts. So again, this goes back to that study, the tree of knowledge, which is the tree of technology. The type of knowledge that is referring to is scientific knowledge. And once Adam and Kava ate of the tree of scientific knowledge, their imagination and consciousness became open or unlocked. And the first thing they did was invented skirts. So the skirts was the first creation made by human beings. Then we go to Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, and Qayin sexed his wife, and she got pregnant and birthed Enoch, and he built a city. So again, you see the inventions of skirts, building a city, and again, all this stuff is before the flood. And in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, where you have Cain or Qayin building a city, this is something he would have learned from his father from his father Adam. So Most likely the city that, it ain't even most likely, it's almost proof that that city that in Egypt that Adam was sent to after he was kicked out from the Garden of Eden, he built a city. And we go over that in detail in another study titled Adam Sent to Egypt. And there he built a city out of fire bricks, which is artificial stone, and the pyramids at that time. When you go to Genesis chapter 4, verses 8, it says, And Qayin talked to Hebel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field, Qayin rose up against Hebel, his brother, and killed him. And gets us talking about the inventions of a weapon. The first weapon ever created was by Cain, and it was to kill his brother Abel. And this goes back to that mind's eye being open. You can imagine good, you can imagine evil. Good people invent good things. Evil people invent evil things. And as you see here in Genesis 4:18, you have Cain, which is the wicked one of the wicked one, pretty much invented the first weapon to kill his own brother. When you go to Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 through 17, it says, And Jehovah Elohim commanded Adam, saying, But of the tree of technology of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for in that day ye eat thereof, you shall surely die. And again, this technology, it just means scientific knowledge. When you get to Genesis chapter 3, verse 5, and for this is when Nakash, or the serpent, was deceiving the woman. He says, For Elohim do know that the day ye eat thereof, then that your mind's eye, that imagination and your consciousness shall be open, and ye shall be as Elohim, knowing good and evil, or comprehending right and wrong. In order to understand scientific knowledge, you have to have an imagination, and you have to have that consciousness that tell you what is correct and what is incorrect. So this is comprehending good from evil. When you get to Ezekiel 28 and 17, and this is going over verse 5 because this is the lie, the first lie that pretty much the serpent told, because he said they're going to be like Elohim, and this is not true. When you go to Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 17, this is in reference to Satan. It says, Thine heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You have corrupted your wisdom. The wisdom that he had, he corrupted it by deceiving the woman. And then it says, By reason of your brightness, I will cast you to the ground. I will lay you before kings, and they may behold thee. So this is when the serpent, or Nakash, corrupts his wisdom. When you go to 1 John chapter 4, verses 8, it says, He that love not, know not God, for God is love. So when you go to verse 5, and when it talks, and when the serpent said unto the woman that he shall be as Elohim, knowing good and evil, understanding scientific knowledge really has nothing to do with Elohim. What Elohim is not scientific knowledge. What Elohim is, according to the scriptures in 1 John chapter 4:18, he is love, not scientific knowledge. He understands scientific knowledge, and he used scientific knowledge to create the heavens and the earth, but God is love. And he used scientific knowledge for good. When you go to John chapter 8, verse 44, it says, Ye are of your father, Diablos. And the King James Version Bible says the devil. It says, and the lust. That lust is referring to the imagination, that mind's eye of your father you will do. I go over this in a study called The Serpent Story when I cover Genesis chapter 3, verses 1. The reason it says, you are of your father Diablos, and the imagination of your father shall you do. The reason the serpent, or Nakash, deceived the woman was to kill Adam and Kava. And the reason he wanted to kill Adam and Kava was the same reasons Cain wanted to kill Abel. It was out of jealousy. On the first day, when Elohim created the light, he pretty much created the galaxy and all the constellations. The scriptures say he called them all by names. He knew all the numbers. He clustered them together. He put his stories in the heavens. And the reason Satan went after the man and the woman, Adam and Kava, was because this constellations in the galaxy. You basically have this constellation that is called Nakash, which represented Satan in the beginning. On the first day, he put Satan under the feet of her, the woman, which is the constellation Virgo. And this is why the scripture says, I will put enemy between thy seed and her seed, is referring to that constellation Virgo, which represents the 12 tribes of Israel. And again, because Satan knew that he was put under the feet of Israel, he became jealous, and his goal was to exalt his throne above the throne of God's. It says he was a murderer from the beginning. How did the serpent murder in the beginning? He deceived Adam and Eve into eating of that forbidden tree, which Elohim said, if they eat thereof, they shall surely die. So that deception, he committed murder by deceiving them. He says, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of himself, for he is a liar and the father of it. So in other words, the reason people are called the children of Satan, because Satan was the first one to deceive, to lie, to murder. And people who follow that path and choose not to obey Elohim or keep his plans, his will, his goals, they are just like the serpent from the beginning. He's spiritually their father. So when you get to verse 22, this is still the progeny or descendants of Cain. It says, and Zillah, she also bare Tubal Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and the sister of Tubal Cain was Naamah. Now I have the definition of artificer here, and it just means a skilled craftsman or inventor, and again in brass and iron. And again, this is before the flood. So before the flood, you have at least the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, the Middle East. It was full of technology. And this goes back to Genesis chapter 11, verse 3, when it says, and they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had fire brick for artificial stone, and masent had they for mortar. This was after the flood, but this is something that they would have known or learned before the flood. And this goes back to, again, that study titled Adam Sent from Egypt, that this is all technology that existed before the flood. So you had fire brick to build the pyramids. You had before the flood skilled craftsmen in brass and iron, which means they would have also been mining. I'm just scroll up here. You have the invention of weapons before the flood. You have them building cities, the inventions of clothes, and so on. Get to verse 23. It says, and Lamech said unto his wife, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, listen unto my speech, for I have killed a man to my wounding. This means he killed someone in self-defense, and a boy to my hurt. The King James Version Bible actually used a young man, but young man come from one Hebrew word, and that Hebrew word just means a boy. So that's why I have boy here instead. And basically, what's going on in verse 23 is Cain. It's not spoken directly, but this is about the God taking vengeance out on Cain, because Cain is a fugitive and a nomadic wanderer on the run. He ends up getting killed by one of his own great grandchildren in self-defense. He's again a fugitive and a vagabond on the run. He's a murderer, and he apparently tries to kill Limac, probably not knowing that Limac was one of his descendants. And in self-defense, Limac kills Cain out of self-defense. And this is why you get to verse 24. It says, if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, in other words, if Cain shall be avenged by Elohim for committing murder, truly Limac 70 times 7, because that means he had to kill Cain out of self-defense. And that's and again, that lineage of Cain is put in there so you can understand Cain's death, how God take vengeance out on Cain for murdering his brother Abel. He ended up being killed by the seed of his own creation, his own descendants. Now, one of the things that I have here is just a timeline, and I have this here because, as you can see, from Seth we even go to Methuselah, or let's see, yeah, we'll go from Seth to Lamech. These are Seth descendants. One of the things that the lineages of Seth do, that the lineage of Cain does not do, they does not give you their age when they were having kids. It just say they begat, or they gave birth to. When you look at the descendants of Seth, it gives you a time frame so you can follow when they was born. So when Seth was 105, he had Enos. When Enos was 90, he had Canaan. When Canaan was 65, he had Methuselah, and so on and so on. So the main thing I want to point out here is that during that age, Seth would have still been alive. This is his son, grandson, great, 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 and even his great, 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 great grandson. He was still alive. So when you look at the descendants of Cain down to Lamech, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. And again, I'm going to scroll back up. Seth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. Just like Seth was still alive when his 5th generation was upon the earth, Cain was still alive when his 5th generation was upon the earth. They lived a lot longer back then. And then also, this diagram kind of sums up this subsection of scriptures from Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 to 24, showing you the lineage of Cain, so you know how Cain died. And with that being said, this concludes this gospel.